If you need to eat it to survive, I think the answer is yes. I think that an appropriate moral theory would recognize that the value of your life is greater than the value of the pig's life in terms of what you'll gain or lose if you stay alive or die, compared to what the pig has to lose or gain. And the lower status of the animal means that their right to life, and I do think they've got one, but their right to life will be weaker, and consequently, I think on balance, the result is yes, it's permissible out of necessity to eat a pig. The first notion is actually which kinds of creatures count at all. There are ways of mistreating, ways one shouldn't treat an object or an animal or a human being. But sometimes we have this extra thought that if I do mistreat, let's say, the creature, then it's not just that I've acted wrongly, I have wronged the creature itself. So in the pig case that we were discussing a moment ago, if I just liked hearing pigs squeal and so I kick the pig, that's not an adequate moral justification. So there I've not only acted immorally, I have wronged the pig. The idea is the pig has moral standing. And then the next question we have to ask is, by virtue of its moral standing, what is it that we are permitted to do to it? What is it we're not permitted to do to it? Given conflicting interests between us and pigs, or the pig and some other animal, which claims are stronger, which rights are stronger? If it turned out that certain types of animals or certain individuals routinely had stronger claims of a certain sort than another type of animal or another individual, then it would make sense to summarize that by saying there's a hierarchy. Our moral claims are stronger and will typically outweigh those of other non-human animals or non-persons that will count, but they'll count in a weaker way, and so we have strongest to intermediate strength to weaker and down. And that kind of ranking is what I have in mind when I start thinking about a hierarchy within animal ethics. No, so that's an important contrast, really the central important contrast with the pig case with which you began. You stipulated in your example that if the only way to stay alive was to eat a pig, would that be permissible? And then I do think the answer is yes, assuming that pigs have the kind of psychology that we currently take them to have. But the crucial point there is not just that the pig has a lower status than we do, though that does seem to me to be part of the story. It's also important that there's necessity involved. We won't be able to stay alive, in your example. I won't be able to stay alive unless I eat the pig. Well, if you now change it to something more realistic in the kind of circumstances that you and I, and likely anybody watching this interview is going to find themselves in, I don't need to eat pig meat. I don't need to eat chickens, et cetera, to stay alive. I've been a semi-vegetarian for decades, and as it happens, I've never lost my taste for meat. I still crave hamburgers. I still miss corned beef. And so on. But I have to admit that although meat substitutes don't quite hit the mark, the difference is sufficiently small that that's not remotely adequate to justify eating a cow or beef or something like that. Now, one obvious capacity that seems relevant is the ability to feel pleasure and pain, but that's not at all the only thing that matters. If we start asking ourselves, how would we try to persuade somebody else that they were treating us improperly, that we had rights or claims that needed to be respected and honored, we might start talking about our various goals and our various ambitions and the plans we had for our lives. That if they treat us in this way, we won't be able to carry through on. That introduces to the discussion, indirectly, appeal to the capacities we have to make long-term plans, to have various kinds of goals, to have various kinds of goods of a complex and sophisticated sort in our life. All right, so you start thinking about that, and then you're struck by the thought, I'm struck by the thought, that other members of the animal kingdom, besides humans, besides people, also have plans. Further reflection leads to the thought that their plans are less sophisticated than ours. The goods that they can have in their lives we can often have similar goods in our lives, but they seem to be less valuable goods to us in our own lives than the other goods that we can sometimes go for. And so these thoughts lead you, it's not an easy process, but these thoughts lead you to beginning to think about, okay, so which psychological characteristics are more important? Wooden creatures that had the same capacities, but perhaps to a smaller degree or weaker versions, they would have a kind of status, but perhaps a weaker status. And that's where the theory begins to evolve. Good. So I wouldn't want to limit it to the capacities that we're good at. So to give an example, which is one that often comes to mind for me, I gather that dogs have a highly sophisticated sense of smell that we don't have. And so it seems to me possible, believe me, I don't actually know whether this is true, but I can imagine it being the case that dogs have some kind of olfactory aesthetic experience, which we don't have, in some ways similar to the kind of visual aesthetic experience that we have. And it does seem that our enjoyment of visual beauty is one of the great goods of human lives. And if dogs had something similar, then I'd say, oh, look, so there's an aspect that raises their status, and now they have to be counted more than I had previously anticipated. And if it should turn out that other animals have other similar capacities for things that I can see and I can recognize, even if I can't myself experience or consume or take in my own life, other kinds of goods, then those would be status-enhancing capacities for them as well. Yeah, I actually, that's a wonderful question. One sub-aspect of that question is, would you be benefiting the given creature if you enhanced, of course, the word enhancing already suggests the answer, but if you altered the cognitive capacities to become more complex, more sophisticated, perhaps be able to contemplate or think about various thoughts in a broader way than they're currently capable. So the fact that we call it enhancement already reveals the common sense attitude, which is that would be an improvement. Now, would it be a benefit for them? Well, I think the answer actually is yes, it would be a benefit for them. And one way of thinking about that is to think to yourself, what do you feel about your own life versus this is science fiction, of course, but the alternative universe in which you hadn't been a person, but had instead been born as a dog or a fish. If some, I'm not sure whether I should think of it as a fairy godmother or an evil demon, were to come along and offer me that choice, or perhaps they were to say, look, you can, like in these fairy tales, when the fairy godmother appears at the christening and says, here's the wonderful future that I've got, I'm going to bestow through my magical powers on your child, and imagine that the fairy godmother, except I suppose in this instance, to my mind, it would be the evil fairy godmother evil fairy comes along and says, good news, I'm going to turn your child into a fish, and they'll have a fish life. Well, unthinkingly, I don't think, oh, thank you, fairy godmother. What a wonderful gift you have bestowed. I think what a horrible thing you've done to my child. And the focus there isn't what a loss to me. Well, it would involve a loss to me because I won't be able to communicate with my child. I think, what a loss to my child. It will be condemned to the minimally desirable life of a fish. Well, if you've got that thought, and I certainly have that thought, then the flip side of it is to say that our life is better than their life, in which case there'd be a kind of benefit to the creature if it could only be a person rather than a fish. Now, there are metaphysical issues that arise here because it's only a benefit to the fish if the transformation would preserve identity. That is to say, it's got to be the very same individual who started out as a fish and becomes a person. There are complicated theories in philosophy about the nature of identity of individuals across time. And on some of these theories, transforming the fish wouldn't really be turning the fish into a person. It would be killing the fish and replacing it with some alternative thing that looked like a fish but wasn't the same fish. If that's what's going on, then you're not really benefiting the fish at all. But if you've got a theory of identity across time where you really could enhance the fish and the fish would survive the transformational process, then I think that really would be benefiting the fish. Yes, I think that is right. Indeed, I think it's almost inevitable if you have the kind of view that I have, where your status depends on the capacities you have. I don't have a narrow view about what kind of capacities are relevant, and I don't think they're limited to, as we might think of them, intellectual capacities. Your emotional capacities might be relevant, your affective capacities more broadly. Possibly other aspects about your character will come into it. And I actually have certain views of a even more controversial sort, where certain truths about not the capacities that you do have, but the capacities you could have had, I think those probably matter as well. But anyway, bracketing that, you're born as as an infant, and the capacities of an infant are very, very limited. They don't have any sense of themselves as one creature among many with a future that can go one way versus another. The scope of preferences in a newborn, very, very limited. And yet, somehow those creatures end up being creatures like you and I are, where we have the ability to project ourselves into the future and have very complex and sophisticated preferences, and we can achieve things and appreciate great works of art. Well, it's not as though at one moment they have this very low status, and then suddenly at a certain moment they flip into creatures like us. There's this long developmental process. That's what goes on in childhood and adolescence and the like. And so the status is increasing over time. Some of us will begin to lose our cognitive capacities. We will become senile or demented, suffer Alzheimer's. And certainly in extreme cases of Alzheimer's, the way we are at the end of our lives, I think, are creatures with lower moral status. Now, again, it doesn't mean that they don't count. After all, the entire view I've got is that animals count too, and they count in such a way as to deserve to be treated far, far better than we typically currently do treat animals. And so I'm not saying, okay, so if you become demented, we can just discard you. You will still have all sorts of claims, but it does seem to me that your status will decline at that point. Great. So, of course, a lot turns on facts about what's going on in the psychology of the fetus at various stages of pregnancy. Certainly, a fertilized egg, suppose that's what, slightly misusing the term fetus to talk about from fertilization all the way up to birth. A fertilized egg, I think, has no status at all. I think it's controversial what exactly goes into grounding even minimal moral standing. But the two main dimensions that it seems to me matter are, on the one hand, the ability to feel pleasure and pain, and so a kind of minimal degree of sentience. And on the other hand, one of the things that is very important for giving us one kind of status versus another kind of status is these other features I've been talking about, having various desires about how you want your life to go, having the ability to act on those desires if you're not impeded. I use the term agency for that second set of things. Well, fetuses don't have agency. Even late-term fetuses don't have agency. Certainly early-term fetuses don't have agency. And based on our best science, as far as I can tell so far, early fetuses don't have not only agency, they don't have sentience. They don't feel pleasure or pain for quite some time. So my own view is they don't have status. Now things are slightly more complicated. I mentioned a few moments ago that I think that certain metaphysical truths, not just about your actual capacities, but about the capacities you could have had, that has bearing on your moral status. Similarly, the fact that you have a potential to become a person, that has bearing on your moral status as well. But my own view about the way at least potential works, and probably this other metaphysical truth about what you could have been, these act as, to use the metaphor I think of it in terms of, these act as amplifiers. They enhance your moral status. They take the signal that's there from your actual capacities and they strengthen it. But that means there's got to be already a signal there to be amplified. If I'm right in thinking that, at least in the case of early pregnancy, the early fetus doesn't have any standing at all, although it's true that it has the potential to become a creature with significant standing, that fact has no, that fact about its potential doesn't have any signal to amplify. And so it's still the case that at least early fetuses, as far as I can see, don't have moral standing. Yes, it seems to me, in the case of potential, or for that matter, the other metaphysical property I had in mind, where we talk about this individual perhaps, we could imagine a human being that suffered some kind of stroke and is not a person now, or had some disease or head injury, and so they're severely cognitively impaired. So they're not a person, but we think it's true to say they could have been a person had they not suffered the head injury and the like. So you're beginning to talk about an alternative possible history of the world. And those alternative possible histories where the creature that is not in the actual world a person, in that alternative history would have been a person, those alternative histories can be nearby, near misses, or they can be more and more and more remote. And there's something similar then in the case of potentiality. A 1-year-old, typically, or maybe a 3-month-old human baby is not yet a person, but it clearly has the potential to become a person, and that's a very close by possibility. By the time many babies are, 9 months, 12 months, they're exhibiting at least minimal personhood. In contrast, the fetus at late pregnancy is a potential person, but it's a more remote potentiality. Early pregnancy, even more remote. You take the sperm and the egg that have not yet joined, that's even more remote. You take a chemistry set that happens to have the right chemicals, such that if only we could combine them in the right way, they too could become something that could develop into a person. There's a potential there, but at that point the potential is very remote. So yes, these more metaphysical properties, they come in degrees. Absolutely. I think that's actually one of the few things that I'm completely confident about with regard to the various views that I've been trying to work out. I mean, one of the striking things when you talk to people about, so who counts the way that we do, initially they will say something like human beings do. I say, but you don't really think only human beings count this way. I start talking with people then about Superman, right? So Superman is not a Homo sapiens. He is not a human being, where we're restricting the notion of human being to some member of our species. But we all think that Superman counts in the same way that you or I do. Why is that so? It's because Superman's a person. It's irrelevant that he's not a human being. So similarly, if you took a chimp, or for that matter, a dog, or for that matter, a fish, And if we had the technology that would allow us to convert it, and so we convert it, we give it the gene therapy or the super vitamin. We give it the super vitamin that turns the dog into a person, something able to communicate with us about its goals and its desires, and able to appreciate art and whatever it might be, then yes, I think it would have exactly the same moral standing that you and I have. To really make progress on that question, you'd first have to get further along in the theory that I've only been waving my hands about with regard to what kinds of features ground higher or lower status. And so I do think it's pretty clear that those features can come in lesser degrees than we have. On some views about the relevant features, those features can, as we might put it, max out. There's an upper limit as to how much of this one could conceivably have, in which case, if it should turn out that we already have the maximum amount, then there's no possibility of superior beings. On the other hand, it does seem to me that for a lot of the capacities that strike us as plausibly relevant, as contenders for being relevant to status, it doesn't seem that they max out. Or if they do max out, there's no particular reason to think that we're near the maximum. And of course, it could well be that there are features that we don't possess at all, but if only we were to become familiar with them, we would recognize, oh yeah, those really do enhance status as well. And creatures greater than us could have them, and they'd have a higher moral standing. Some people, when they think about that prospect, find it very upsetting and unacceptable. I find it humbling, but actually plausible. So remember that my view about the way we treat animals is, despite the fact that I think that there's a hierarchy where there are certain things that we can do in the kind of necessity cases that you're talking about, the overwhelming majority of the ways in which we treat animals constitute mistreatment of animals. Even if there are these super beings, just like it's not okay for me to eat the pig, because there's no necessity. There's no necessity for the super beings, I presume, to eat us once they land on our planet and discover us. There might well be cases in which some of their claims and rights will trump ours, and maybe that will be surprising to us. As I say, it'll certainly be humbling. But I'm not worried that the upshot of this is going to mean we can be treated by them the way that we currently treat animals, because I think even animals already count sufficiently highly that the way we treat animals is utterly unjustified. I actually do think that. So earlier I said that it seemed to me that moral standing crucially depends on, at least two dimensions seem relevant. There's the ability to feel pleasure and pain, sentience, being conscious, something like that. And then there's this agency aspect, which can come in higher or lower degrees. When I think about this, I imagine our landing on some other world and discovering for lack of a better word, a race of robots that have somehow evolved naturally, and we stipulate that they're not conscious in the sense that they don't have this qualitative aspect of experience. But for all that, they've got preferences, they've got desires, they have culture, they have civilization. We learn their language, or they learn our language, and as you're about to take your screwdriver to one of their young robot children, the robot parent comes running along, either screaming at you or pleading with you, do not turn off my child, this is murder. I think that's exactly right. I know that there are people who, when they think about this thought experiment, have a rather different reaction, and they say, oh, no, it's just a very convincing simulation of something that counts. And I think, no, that's being too hung up on the ability to feel pleasure and pain. The fact that these creatures have desires about how they want their lives to go seems to me to grant them moral standing, and it would be wrong to kill them or to turn them off. Our knee-jerk reaction, of course, is, of course it is, but it turns out to be more complicated if you think that animals count. It looks as though the same sort of rules that govern when is it permissible for me to kill another person, at first, as a first pass, we'd have to say, govern when is it permissible for me to kill the lion who's attacking my child. And it turns out that this question becomes very complicated very quickly. So I'm going to try to quickly get to some of the key points. So one thing is that we do think, in terms of person-to-person interactions, that if the attacker, if somebody comes along in an unprovoked way, attacks my child, or attacks me for that matter, I have a right to self-defense, and I have a right to defend my child on their behalf if they can't. That's permissible. So at least as a first pass, it would seem to follow that if the lion, in an unprovoked way, is attacking my child, then it's permissible. But not a second pass, it's more complicated, because the lion, unlike a deliberate aggressor or deliberate attacker, well, is not a deliberate aggressor, at least in the sense of, this is not a creature that is thinking to itself, I'm about to do something that doesn't really have a moral justification, but I just don't care. I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway. That's what we have in mind as we imagine the kind of paradigmatic, deliberate, unjustified, unprovoked attacker. The lion is something closer to, or perhaps is a kind of, what gets known in the philosophical literature as an innocent threat. The lion is threatening me or my child, but isn't a fully responsible threat. And so the next question we have to ask is, it's one thing to say that it's permissible to use, let's say, lethal force against a deliberate aggressor. Is it also permissible to use lethal force against an innocent threat? And interestingly enough, people's intuitions differ about this very important question, and philosophers who write on the subject differ from one another about this important question. So to be very simple-minded about it, there's going to be two schools of thought, right? One school is going to say you may not treat innocent threats by the same rules. We don't use the same rules to govern how we can treat innocent threats. Killing an innocent threat is not permissible, which is to say it's more like killing a bystander. I mean, suppose that the only way that you could preserve your child's life, not that the lion's now attacking, is that they need a heart transplant. And there's no available heart organ. But over there is a pedestrian, well, I don't know how we know this, but happens to have the right blood type and available heart. They're perfectly healthy, right? Most of us would not think it was permissible to grab that person, kill them, take their heart, even though that's the only way to defend your child, to save your child, rather, preserve your child, because they're a bystander. Well, if innocent threats are like that, then we have to say, rather surprisingly, that it's not permissible to kill the attacking lion to save your child. Well, that's if we go that route. On the other hand, if we go the route of saying it is permissible to kill innocent threats, then that at least opens the door to saying, and so it's permissible to kill the lion in defense of my child, despite the fact that it's an innocent threat. Now, things get even more complicated because the rules governing innocent threats, even if they're permissibly harmed, aren't exactly the same as the rules governing deliberate threats. And so we then have to ask ourselves about, okay, so when we tweak them in such a way as to see the kind of innocent threat that the lion is, probably the door is still open. And then there are further complications as well, because if I'm right in thinking that we need to adjust our various moral rules to take into account the different possible moral statuses of the creatures we're interacting with, then my suspicion is that since the lion has a lower moral status than a human normally does, a human innocent threat, it will actually be harder to justify using lethal force in defense of my child. It will become somewhat proportionately easier to justify harming the lion despite being an innocent threat, by virtue of its fact that it has a lower status. And so now we have this interesting conflict. By virtue of the fact that the lion is an innocent threat, that is an innocent threat, it becomes harder to use force, harder to justify using force than it would if it were a deliberate aggressor, a responsible agent. On the other hand, by virtue of the fact that it's a lion that I have to use lethal force against, it becomes easier to justify. And so you've got these two morally relevant considerations tugging us in opposite directions. And to really work out the answer here, we would have to first work out each of these two features and then come up with a view about which one outweighs the other. And that's a very nice illustration as a result of how, on the one hand, taking the standing of animals seriously requires a lot of extra work in moral philosophy, and in a way that we don't normally extend these rules to animals. But at the same time, taking the hierarchy approach to animal ethics, which I believe in seriously, will require complicating the rules in ways we've barely begun to try to work out. And so the whole field of moving moral philosophy from the more insular domain where we only thought about interpersonal relations to the extended domain where what kind of moral rules govern our interactions with animals is going to require a huge rethinking of our moral outlook.